All right, Logan. I know we've done this like multiple times before. We talk privately, but still, like, can you introduce yourself for the audience?
Yeah, Eric, first off, man, I really appreciate you asking me on again. Like you mentioned, we've done this a couple of times now, but I always welcome the opportunity to talk shop and share some experiences. So, yeah, Logan Jones. I am in my second season with the Chicago White Sox, seventh overall in professional baseball. Spent the previous 5 seasons with the Arizona Diamondbacks, and before that point in time, uh, I completed a couple of collegiate internships, one at the University of Kentucky, working with a variety of sports, and then one at Wake Forest University, working primarily with baseball, women's soccer, but then also assisting in some other areas as well. So I've been super fortunate to this point to kind of have an accelerated path to where I am, but then also have some exposure to some really cool people and excellent mentors that have helped guide me. So I'm looking forward to hopefully sharing some information, some knowledge that can help some people along in their journeys as well. But thanks again for asking me on, man.
Appreciate you, man. Appreciate you. So, the first thing I want to ask is like, you work with Arizona Diamondback, now at White Sox. So basically, like all like elite level athletes, like high level performance settings. So the first thing is like since I got to the state, there's like basically everybody wants to work at pro setting. Everybody wants to work at like pro baseball, pro basketball, exos, P3, those high level like settings. So if I'm gonna ask you like what are some like advice or some suggestion that you can give to like the young coaches, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think and that's a tough one to answer too, because I think everyone's in a different place. Everyone's in a different spot. Surely I was, back in 2017. I was an unpaid intern. I didn't really know what I was doing in the field, and of course, in search of knowledge and information, the answers, if you will. How do I, if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to find myself in that position or this position. And unfortunately, it's not that black and white. It's not that easy. I think generally speaking, you of course have to have all of your things in alignment. Like you have to have your resume kind of built out. You have to have a training philosophy, a coaching philosophy, an idea of kind of what you're in search of and what you're looking for, your desires, your preferences. But then from there, I think a vulnerability, so a willingness to ask questions, to put yourself out there, to send an email, to direct message someone on social media, I think really goes a long way, because what that does is that basically establishes a connection, a relationship with someone that, yes, it may or may not pay off for you in that moment. But really, I'm thinking we're playing the long game here. Over the course of time, over the period of time, you build relationships, network, if you will. Those really help to create a web within our coaching industry, whether it's, I work in baseball. I know your preference is basketball, and really it's all one and the same. Yes, like we have some nuanced things that we do in training. But really at the end of the day, connections are connections, or relationships are relationships. And I think if the priority is to really build out those connections and do what you and I are doing right now, um, to me, that's kind of a solid foundation in which to build. And then from there, you can branch out more specifically if you want to work in, collegiate baseball, or if you want to work collegiate track and field, or professional soccer, professional baseball, then establishing those connections within those places and being willing to like make a site visit, put a face to a name, stuff like that, I think goes a long way and shows some initiative, which I think then leaves a lasting impression on maybe someone that you're interested in connecting with that may help you get your foot in the door.
Nice, nice, nice. So, and after that, the second question would be like, man, this one's gonna be tough. In like high level setting and pro setting, I know it's like very high intense every day. Like you need to like give your athlete like the best of you every day. And even that, like sometimes uh they're not gonna play very good. So I know like some director of performance or like some strength coaches at pro setting, they'll say like they worry about the job security every day. So can you like talk a little bit about this? Like it's not always like super fantastic, like always like sexy to get that job. What is it like to have those stress?
Yeah, it's very real. And I think at times, depending on, how the I'll use my our organization as an example, right? Like we have a major league team, we have a farm system, a handful of minor league teams that are a feeders, our feeder teams, our feeder system to the major league level. We have some lower level um, professional leagues that are like our DSL, our Dominican Academy, also our Arizona Comics League that help to funnel players to our affiliates, and then hopefully our affiliates to the major league team to help some win some baseball games at the major league level. But yes, I think that unfortunately, this is a cutthroat, results driven industry, right? And like we're evaluated whether we like it or not, holistically on wins and losses. And then also within that context, there are maybe some performance outcomes, maybe some health outcomes that are taken into consideration, when decisions are made on player personnel, staff personnel, who, are we able to grow out our department, add different resources in different position? Are we able to bring people from outside of the organization in to really like help us grow and challenge our systems? And you're right. Like this, I think externally, this is viewed as a pinnacle of, you know, an S&C or performance job, right? Like, oh, you work at the highest level with the highest level of athlete. There is no higher degree of baseball in the world other than Major League Baseball. Like that is the pinnacle. And I think that uh, when wins aren't coming at the abundance in which we feel like they should on the field, when guys come up with things that we feel like are maybe manageable, or I don't like to use the word avoidable, but things that we feel like we can manage from an injury standpoint, when these things start to pop up, like, of course, we start to evaluate what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I think that's natural. Now, I think at times, like maybe we get too much credit, and at other times, maybe we receive too much of the wrath behind, like when things do happen, right? Like I'm not sure that it's as simple as maybe we would like to make it seem. At times, I think there's a lot of variables at play that fall outside of our control that influence on the field performance. If we're talking from a health standpoint, an availability standpoint, so I think all these things are like stressful in nature because you do worry. Okay, so and so's on a 1 year contract, or so and so is on the last year of their multi-year contract. What is it going to look like this time next year? But in my opinion, I think staying grounded, doing the best that you can to stay, where your feet are, doing the best that you can for these athletes in the moment, every single day, stacking wins. Okay, today's a win. We executed X, Y, and Z. We did these things well. Um, Regardless of an outcome of the game, okay, tomorrow we're going to show up and we're going to be our best self again. And we're going to do that again. And we're going to do it again. Is the really challenging part, especially in our world. We play, at the major league level, 162 games, regular season games. That's excluding spring training in the postseason, right? So you're looking at upwards of like 200 games for a team that wins the World Series. Um, and even at the minor league level, you're looking at 130, 140 plus games. Again, excluding spring training in the postseason. So I think that it's very challenging to stay steady Eddie, show up the same guy. But I think that wins over the course of time because you have people that are riding the wave of the high, and they're also, struggling when things aren't going well. And I think the more that you can be the same guy from an energy standpoint, execute the small things well, those things start to add up. And I think over the course of time, you'll see favorable results within the context of what we can influence over the period of time. But that's a really good question, and it's something that isn't talked about a lot, but it is very real.
Yeah, man. I noticed that. So, um, since it's a high, like very stressful environment, how do you like keep the energy like always high, or not always keep the energy like not being like burned out?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about perspective, um, how we're viewing what we're doing, if that makes sense. You could have the greatest job in the world, and we can definitely find something that's wrong with it, right? Like, or something that you don't like. I think that, like, and also we're geared towards negativity. We're like human nature is we're quick to point out the things that are wrong. We're fixers. Coaches, strength coaches are fixers in nature anyway. We identify a problem, right? This guy's not squatting well. This guy's not hinging well. All right, we have to fix it, right? Like we're really good at identifying problems. I think being a problem solver is critical towards keeping, you know, I guess a level pathway towards keeping that good perspective on things, if you will. Understanding that, man, I'm really fortunate to be in this position to have an influence over all of these players, not only on my team right now of 28, 30 guys, but over an influence over the organization. We're talking player personnel, we're talking field staff, we're talking front office. All of these conversations are had, and it's an opportunity to learn and then also share some experience that may help guide us into the direction that we're looking to go. So I think I think burnout happens when maybe we lose perspective or an understanding or the why behind why we're doing what we're doing. So I feel like trying to like bring yourself back of like, hey, all these things are positive. Like 95% of what I'm doing, I'm really enjoying. Let's not allow the 5% of stress or of external forces that like we can't really necessarily control derail the 95% of what we're doing to be very enjoyable, if that makes sense. So I think it's very much about like how you're looking at your situation and less about the situation itself.
Nice, man. Nice. So, um, I'm gonna jump into the question about like training about biomechanic. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
let's do it.
So, uh, in baseball, it's a rotational sport, and the matter like pitcher pitching the base, pitching the ball, or like hitter gonna hit the ball. So, uh, let's say when it comes to like pitching, can you kind of explain the biomechanic of like pitching? I know this is complicated, man, but like,
Yeah,
can you like kind of explain it, like what it is and how that happened?
yeah, yeah. You're right. It is very complicated and very complex in nature. Like we play a highly sophisticated, highly skilled game that certainly requires different qualities of these guys, maybe when compared to like, maybe a basketball player or something like that. Like maybe golf is similar in nature. Maybe there's some similarities in a tennis player, a volleyball, some kind of an overhead athlete, softball, of course. But I think that when I talk on, just training baseball players and how it relates to like the demand, the skill of what they're asked to do, whether it's a pitcher throwing off the mound, whether it's a hitter in the box, or whether it's a defender, right, moving laterally and, as you mentioned, rotationally. Very little of what we do happens in the sagittal plane, and on top of that, in a bilateral manner, like almost exclusively, we're moving frontal transverse, unilaterally. So I think that a lot of what we do in the weight room mirrors that demand, or like we really hammer home some of these foundational movement patterns, but ensure that the transfer is applicable to what they're doing out on the field. So your question towards uh, I guess the biomechanics of pitching, I'm thinking more of it from a kinematic standpoint. I look at it from a movement standpoint. So what's going on at the lower half from the ground up? How does that transfer up through the core and ultimately to the upper extremity through ball release? And I look at it more also from a gait standpoint, right? Like I relate it to like gait mechanics. So you have, we'll call it a loading pattern, which is, you're in three planes of motion: IR, ER, flexion, extension, AB, adduction. So we have these different things that are in play. With a hip load, take a drive leg for a pitcher. Okay. That's going to be more of a loading pattern on that backside. It's going to transfer more to an unloaded pattern, exploded pattern on that back leg as he moves down the slope. So we go from a neutral position to a loading pattern. Okay. A good glute load, a hinge. You hear all these buzzword terms, right? Then as we move down the slope towards the hitter, towards ball release, the backside goes more towards an exploded pattern. So that's going to be more of an abducted, externally rotated, extended state on the backside. But then reciprocally on the front side, we're going more towards a loading pattern. So in that left hip, now we're going more towards the IR, the abduction, the flex state. So I think in the lower half, I see things moving front, side to side, not front to back, east to west versus north to south. So I think like side to side versus front to back. And then obviously within that context, there are pitchers that are more rotational in nature, ones that are more like north to south. But generally speaking, we all need to be able to move here and here. And I think if we're talking lower half specifically, we're looking to train these qualities, ensure that at lower velocities in the weight room, we build strength, stability, control. If there's a mobility concern, of course, we address that. And then as we look to bridge the gap from the weight room out onto the field, we start to increase ranges of motion. We add some velocities. We put them on one leg. Maybe we do some blending drills to help connect the dots between what we're doing in the weight room and out onto the field. I'm not sure that a lateral lunge alone goes and transfers to a great extent out onto the mound. That makes sense. I think that like we need to challenge them at a higher velocity. We need to add different loading strategies and methodologies to like help us bridge the gap between what's going on in the weight room, which is a controlled environment, looks not that much like baseball, if we're being honest, to our highly skilled task of like pitching for your example here. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, and I know I only talked lower half there, but when I'm looking at like what's going on from a skill standpoint on the field, I'm looking from a movement, you know, variability, movement capacity standpoint. And then we can have these conversations with the skill coaches, the pitching coach, the hitting coach, defensive coaches about how we can influence sometimes in real time through for the use of a water bag or an external cue, or hey, an outcome. Hey, we just want you to execute this throw to your arm side or to your glove side. We're looking to reduce like some of the mental demand that comes along with like overcoaching and stuff like that goes on in the weight room. We can be specific in here, but because it's so highly skilled out there, our overthinkers on the field are not our highest performers, if that makes sense. So we prep them as part of their training to make it so when they go out there, the job is to execute, is to perform. We reduce the mental demand, and then that way we have prepared them not only physically but also mentally for what's to come that night.
Nice, nice. I glad that you break it down like in ER, IR, like abduction, adduction. Because like if you're gonna say like math equation, I'm not gonna understand those shit. But
Yeah,
like ER, IR, abduction, adduction, that's easy.
yeah. No,
So
and look,
yeah.
I'll add this too. I'll add this too. I don't mean to interrupt. The reason why I'll say this, I see it in this way because, well, one, I don't, I'm not a biomechanist, right? Like, so I don't, I didn't go to school for that. So I would say like my level of like understanding and education and training on that is just obviously much lower than what someone who works in a lab may have, right? But on top of that, also like some of those things aren't we can't communicate to the player. You know what I mean? Some of those things that are things that help us are contextual information. We have biomechanists for a reason, right? They send us a biomechanics report with all of the things that they're taking a look at. Um, Pelvic rotation, trunk rotation, if it's a hitter, hand, bat speed, launch angle, exit velocity, batted ball metrics, swing metrics, all of these types of things that the player themselves may not understand, or they might not even care to understand, right? Like they just want to go out and perform well. So how can we fill the bucket? How can we fill in the gaps to help bridge the communication between like what we're getting in a lab, for example, into the weight room, but then how do we connect the weight room out onto the like more of a performance environment too? So that's the reason why I see it more from a movement standpoint of just, hey, like the things that we learned in school, right? Of what's going on at the pelvis, what's going on the lower half, what's going on at the thorax, the rib cage, what's going on at the extremities, the head and the neck, etc. That's kind of how I see it. And then we can relate those types of things and blend with the biomechanics report, blend with the sports science stuff, blend with the on-field coaching that may be more traditional in nature. And now we have a well-rounded approach to best help our player.
Nice, nice. I like it. I like it. Because, man, yeah, when you talk to athlete equation math, that's not gonna work. If you talk to them about like how the hip move, internal rotation, external rotation, they're understand it. I like it. So
And
one
sometimes
thing,
you demo
yeah,
it. Sometimes you have to show them, you know what I mean?
yeah,
Like, hey,
yeah,
get out there and
yeah,
I'm not just going to like preach at you and let you know, I'm gonna get on the ground and I'm gonna show you what I'm talking about. I'm gonna do it myself, right? And then that way
yeah,
they have a greater appreciation and a visual for what you're asking them to do. And they see that you're willing to do it yourself, right? Like it's not just something that you're expecting them to do. It's like, no, like here, see, I can get in the position. Like I know you can too. Let me, help you get in that because I really feel like it's going to help you achieve whatever outcome measure you have um, the organization has for you out on the field.
yeah, man. So one thing I do notice about a lot of like pitcher kind of do is when they stand on their back leg and they lift their like front leg, they kind of do like internal rotation on both hips. Like, why is that? I don't understand. Why is that?
Are you talking like at like on leg lift at the peak height of the leg lift? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah,
Before their center of mass is moving down the slope, it's kind of
yeah,
like they gather over the mound.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
For me, I see that as we're starting to create energy. We're starting to pull out slack, pull some tension. And I see it as kind of like a preset, if you will. We're creating some pre-tension. We're like stretching the rubber band and we're getting ready to let it go. Or we're twisting up the bottle, we're getting ready to pop off the cap. Um, so that's kind of like the whole point of a leg lift in general. It's a timing mechanism. It's also a way to create some momentum, some energy, towards home plate. Now, like I think that sometimes that can mess with the timing, right? The sequencing of things, like things can get out of whack. That's where you see erratic command. You see also changes in like pitch velocity, pitch shape, pitch metrics, and in severe cases, that's where injury comes into play too, right? Like where a guy has a super late arm because his pelvis is early or his trunk is early and now he's dragging. He's stuck like in layback, right? Now he's actually trying to create like IR, just at the shoulder. It's not really along for the ride. I think that's where we start to get in trouble sometimes. Um, but to your point specifically on the leg lift, like to me, I see that as it's a timing mechanism. It's a way to create some momentum, some force generated. And depending on the pitcher too, like everybody's a little different. Some guys like to preset into more of like a hip hinge, a hip load, because it helps build like some pretension. And I think for the guys that take some time to create some force, that may be a good strategy. And we can get to some of those, you know, that intuition like through some of our force plate testing, right? Like if it's a guy that can produce some force, but he takes a while to be able to produce it. Okay, maybe we're presetting some tension there, so that way we remove the time that necessary to build it. Versus a guy that produces force the same amount of force but quicker. Okay, maybe that guy can shift in and out of positions. That means he can go from a neutral state to an IR to an ER state pretty efficiently and effectively, and do it at a high velocity over and over and over. Maybe that guy doesn't have the same strategy or the same mechanism of creating that tension or momentum towards home plate. So it's that this is where the problem solver in me comes out. I think is like we take bits and pieces of information from all these different experts on our team, if you will, and now we have to contextualize it to figure out, okay, like in his training program, what does that mean? When we get this information on our force plates, how can we utilize that information? It doesn't make the decision for us. It just informs our decisions and helps maybe guide at times for like what might be best. There's still some trial and error, right? Like there's still some like I'm not completely sure if this is going to work. If we were, every single strength coach would have all the answers, and you get what I'm saying, and like no one would ever get injured, and we would just win every game. Like that's just not how it works. So I think that like all these bits and pieces of information help to like bring us back to how does a guy need to create momentum? How does he need to gather over the rubber to then move down the slope and do it over and over again? It's a hell of a lot deeper than, oh, this guy this feels good. You know what I mean? There's a reason why it feels good.
Nice, nice. So, uh, I know it's probably the same with like hitting the ball. Yeah, basically the same, but like can you like still walk us through like what is it for the lower half to like hit the ball?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we don't have to exclusively talk in the lower half. I feel like the lower half is very important to me. I feel like when things are going well, or on the flip side when they're not, like generally speaking, there's something to clean up on the lower half, right? Like whether it's a backside hingy load mechanism, if it's force transfer from the backside to the front side, if it's like a front side deceleration, if it's a directional issue, a separation, like generally something's going on at the pelvis, uh, or at the foot. I would say like the at the hips and at the foot, like generally something's going on there, good or bad, that influences what's going on at the knee. So we'll see like guys that shoot in the back knee or something like that. That's generally a byproduct of what's going on at the hip or the foot. Um, or I would say it should be. It should be a byproduct of what's going on at the hip or the foot. And then as we make our way up, like to your question on hitting here, you're right. It's very similar in nature. I would say the two big things for hitting versus pitching. There's a time pressure with hitting that doesn't exist as much with pitching. So a pitcher generally goes on their own cadence, right? Like there's a pitch clock now, kind of like a shot clock in basketball. But for the most part, right, if you get going on time, you can kind of dictate your own cadence towards delivering the pitch. A hitter doesn't have that luxury. There's a time pressure that's in place, and there's all these different pitch shapes and pitch types, and it changes pitcher to pitcher. So then there's a lot of game planning that goes into this as well. But the point is, you have to be able to get to a certain position and achieve a certain task a lot quicker in some cases. You have to be able to pull the slack out of the system to get from point A to point B a hell of a lot quicker as a hitter, or more efficiently, I would say, as a hitter. You can probably get away with a little more as a pitcher, if that makes sense. A loose mover may do well better as a pitcher than as a hitter, right? Like if he struggles to get from point A to point B on time, maybe he has trouble catching up to the fastball. Maybe he struggles making the same consistent move, from his launch, like his load launch position to contact. He's going to be inconsistent there. So I would say the time pressure is the first thing that's different. The second thing that's different is also the plane of rotation is slightly different. So a hitter is going to be like a little more hingy in nature in their rotation. I wish I could get up and demonstrate, but basically think a hip hinge, and then the a pitcher is going to be more here, a hitter is going to be more here. So very similar in nature. I would just say the plane of rotation is a little bit different. And to reinforce that, to train that rotational efficiency with med balls, aqua, stuff like that, we do drill work that is catered towards, obviously it's individualized based on need, but then it's also specific to plane of rotation, right? So like we don't want our pitchers, for the most part, unless they're throwing from down here, to be rotating here, right? Like we want them to be rotating more,
Yeah,
generally speaking, more east to west. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So whereas a hitter's going to have a greater degree of hip of tilt, if you will, on their rotation there. And again, all these things are things that we can pick up on some of our biomechanics reports that are sent out and circulated within. But generally speaking, I just ask guys, hey, when we're doing drill work, like when we pick up an aqua bag or an aqua ball or a tube, a bag, yeah, I basically just say, hey, like all you're doing is hitting or you're pitching. I want you to mirror the plane of rotation. I want you to get into your hip hinge the same way you would. You're executing the skill task without the demand of like making a pitch or without making contact. You're doing the same thing. This is a hitting drill or a pitching drill, not a weight room drill. And then it helps to connect the dots. And then you see, in my experience, at least the execution is a little bit better with that. But the hitting and the pitching front, like thankfully, very similar. We train it in a very similar way in the weight room. Those two pieces of the time pressure and then also the plane of rotation is slightly different. And we just accommodate or make an adjustment in the program or in a prep routine, something like that, to make sure that we mirror that and prepare him for the demand of game action.
Nice, nice. So, um, that's the lower half. So on the upper half, I know a lot of like coaches or like athletes, they'll say like hip shoulder dissociation. Still, like, can you like kind of explain that what that is?
Yeah. So when I think like sometimes you'll hear basically like upper half disassociation or T spine rotation or separation, T spine separation, kind of a buzzword, like a generalistic term. I think there are a lot of things that go into this, right? Like pelvic position, uh, rib cage orientation, respiratory mechanics, like all these things influence like how the bone, like bony, landmarks where they are in space and how they're sitting, which obviously influences how what the muscle attachment and then how efficiently the firing patterns of, like, let's say like an oblique musculature, right? A rotational musculature, like how does that influence how that fires and how that sequences? And then also to your point on the separation, what is this guy's degree of separation, right? Like if a guy has a stacked position, we're a neutralized pelvis for the most part, ribs down. Generally speaking, we're going to get more separation, again, east to west, but then we're also going to get better T spine extension, going to be better like shoulder orientation. The scap's going to sit a little bit better on the ribs versus if you have a guy that's excessively anterior tipped, ribs are flared up, kind of driven sympathetically stuck in extension. Now he's not as efficient of a rotator. I would say like maybe an increased injury risk too from a length tension relationship. The muscles are at a disadvantage, um, especially on the anterior portion of that. So I think that we look at ranges of motion certainly, in terms of like separation, both passively and actively. We look at that, and then we also look at dynamic control. So how are guys opening the gap, but how are they also closing the gap, right? In isolation. But then we also look at that more holistically as part of like a biomechanics lab report of how is this guy doing it with a bat in his hand, right? Or a ball in his hand? Is he able to get it, the separation on the table or in the weight room, but it's not transferring out onto the field? Or does he have too much separation and we actually need to close the gap? Sometimes we stiffen guys up. You know what I mean? Like it's not always, hey, let's get as much hip separation as we can, because then we're giving guys range that they don't have control or access to really utilize. Now it's an injury risk. Maybe now it's like we actually hindered his performance by giving him range to something that he can't control. So I think at times like we have to be careful when we tinker, or make small adjustments day to day or week to week, because I feel like if we're not careful, we can actually accidentally set a guy back maybe or put a guy at risk. So I think for every guy that we try to open up and give a little more range to, we're probably pulling some slack or taking range away from another guy on average. Guys are like on one end of the spectrum or the other. It seems like it's like a mobility guy or a stability guy. um, and then we have a handful of guys that are like, okay, like I like where you're at. But it's a constant game, right? Like we're trying to always evaluate, reevaluate, test, retest to figure out what is it that they need right now, because that changes over the period of time too, right? Ranges of motion change as we go throughout the season. Um, Workload plays into this as well. How often are they in game? And what are they doing when they're in game? How many reps are they doing of a certain thing? Like these things all play a factor. So that's kind of like a big hitter generalistic response to the whole T-spine disassociation thing. It's critical and it's important, and it's very important for like pitch velocity, for exit velocity, swing velocity, stuff like that. However, it's not as simple or as trainable as just hitting some T-spine openers and slinging a med ball. It's not, unfortunately, it's not that simplistic.
Yeah, man. I enjoy this. I enjoy this. So, um, I know the next question is, I know it depends on different coaches have different philosophy on this, but like it was a conversation back in like I think 3 or 4 months ago. Like like one of my colleague like brought up about like uh start training start implementing like core stability. So like anti-rotation to rotation and then to like rotational power. So if it's you, is it like this simple, or like can you like walk us through like your philosophy on training rotational power?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think it's definitely applicable to the world that I work in, right? Being a rotational sport, like I definitely think the rotational power is trainable. I think that that's something that we can influence. I also feel like within that context, we have to be cognizant of what else is going on, right? Like in season, when a guy's taking potentially 100 plus swings a day, making how many ever throws a day, probably from the same side. You have some guys that like are a righty throw or lefty hitter. That's kind of ideal in my mind. But like for the most part, everyone throws and swings from the same side, right? Like let's take a position player or a pitcher, whatever. Most of them only throw with one hand, right? So I think that rotational velocity is definitely trainable. I think that we should definitely do it in a way that doesn't put like other areas at large or at risk. Like I'm not sure that we should do it through making excessive amounts of swings or you know under excessively heavy or underloaded like weighted balls as a pitcher. Like I don't know that that's the answer. I do feel like that we can influence this in a way of just putting guys in a better posture, a better position. And then the posture position will dictate or influence function and how well they're able to get from point A to point B, as I kind of talked on earlier. Now, I kind of see like a lot of rotational med ball stuff and stuff like that in season as a good like primer, as a good preparatory drill to get them ready for like the skill. I wouldn't excessively do it because yes, they are also training that rotational pattern over and over and over and over again. But I think we can be a little more specific with how we do it, if that makes sense. Like the volume doesn't need to be high. We can just put them in good positions that like lead to what the outcome that we're looking for. Um, and now with the newer water ball and water bag training that seems to be making its way around, there's ways that we can train some rotational velocity there. The water doesn't weigh all that much, right? Like 6 to 10 pounds, maybe, but it's really difficult to control dynamically. You know what I mean? So we'll have guys hug the bag. We'll have them go back kind of behind like the scaps. We'll have them rotate with it. We'll put them in different positions that help, influence the type of rotation we're looking for. We'll move the lower half. We'll do different hops and jumps and step backs and shuffles and all these types of things that like have the water moving in space. The momentum here is in play. And it helps them organically self-organize to kind of clean up a movement pattern, if you will. And we can double it as like a rotational velo, right? Like it's an underloaded object for the most part, and they like doing it, and it's without stress on the upper extremity for the most part, right? Like there's no like shoulder, forearm, elbow stress going on there. Um, Now to the point on like stability, it's critical in our world. Like so proximal stability, right? Like we're thinking in all areas, right? In the sagittal plane, frontal, transverse, like it's the name of the game. If we don't have our shit together, in our midsection as a baseball player, it's not gonna be favorable over the period of time. So we regress it all the way back to like a sagittal core stabilization, dead bug progression type deal. Like that's a staple in our program. Core pressurization, putting them on the ground, unloaded, loaded. We change weight, ipsilateral, contralateral, you name it. That's in there. We're doing ISO holds in the frontal plane. So you're thinking like frontal plane musculature, I should say. So like thinking like side planks, pow off variations, different carried suitcases, farmer carry, stuff like that. Um, those are staples in our program. Like every single one of our players has that in their program to some extent. Um, Probably multiple times a week as well. A lot of our guys are on more of a microdosed approach. So like we're in the weight room much more often, but for a shorter period of time. But it doubles as an opportunity for us to give them a little bit of what they need every single day that we think is important. Now over the course of the season, right? Like that's a lot of like work for something that we feel like is important, right? If they're hitting some kind of like, hey, today we're hitting whatever, a dead bug in a suitcase carry. All right, tomorrow we're going some kind of a side plank variation with a pow off or something like that. That can almost help to ramp or onboard our work towards our water ball, med ball stuff too, right? So like we have guys doing dead bugs, glute bridges, side planks, getting up, doing a aqua ball or aqua bag drill, finishing with a med ball, going out to catch play. Like we're kind of ramping it up and the velocities are slowly picking up. But again, like we're not in here slinging like 38 med balls from the right side because we think it's going to help us create rotational velo, if that makes sense. It's kind of a sticky topic, and I feel like people are either yes, we train it in the season, or no, we don't. We don't do it because they do it so much on the field. I'm not sure that it's that simple. I think that there's ways to live in the middle and do things as a primer, as a prep, And then also have some targeted work at lower, at lower volumes, where now we can make it make sense with everything else that's going on, and it helps the guy show up better, and be in a safer spot from a health standpoint too, which is obviously something that we're cognizant of.
Nice, nice. So you also brought up like there's like rotational you sorry, aqua bag, aqua ball, those stuff you use, and like you also brought up like some athletes like maybe they're overthinker, they think too much. Some sort of the concept of like I know like trans boss system, like it's kind of like recently kind of pop up in the state. So uh, how do you utilize the aqua ball or aqua bag into your training? Is it only with those rotational stuff? And like, how much extent do you like implement like what's so called the French ball system into your training theory?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you're right. It's made its way into baseball pretty extensively. I would say over the course of the last, we'll call it 3 or 4 years, maybe post COVID. I would say it's big for me and for us. It's something that it's a staple, I would say. Now, I'll say this. I'll say this before we dive in. It is certainly not a replacement for a quality weight training, strength and conditioning program. Like I think that there's people that swing too far to the other end of the spectrum, and they don't, they're not loading and they're just shaking aqua and all that. Like I don't think that that's the answer, right? Like I see this as a supplementary accessory bit of work, the same way that we would do any other accessory bit of work. Now, I think that there's a large bang for your buck. Like we can achieve a lot in a short amount of time. The players enjoy doing it, so there's a decent like degree of buy-in from them. Also, in our coaching staff, huge buy-in. In fact, they're telling players that they can't hit and that they can't go to throwing program until they come do that stuff with me, which is sick, right? Like I think ideally that's where everyone would get, because I think I talked on bang for your buck. I mean it doubles as a warm up, as a prep at a minimum, right? But then also like we can target some more of a needs based approach, right? Like not everyone's doing the same aqua ball, aqua bag drills. We can bucket guys into specific things of what they need and then provide them with a drill package that's specific to address those concerns. And we double it as a warm up. So we're thinking now, okay, we got 15 minutes or whatever, 10 minutes, right? All right, well, maybe we're not just going to do a standard dynamic warm up. Maybe a 5 minute dynamic warm up. Say we travel on a Tuesday to a visiting city or something. We're going to get out there. We're going to do a 5 minute warm up. We're going to do something like a CNS primer type deal, where we have aquas, we have med balls, we have bands. We're going to jump. We're going to sprint. We're doing these dynamic effort moves, and it like takes 10 minutes. And now we've warmed up. We've primed them for the demand. We've maybe addressed some kind of movement strategy that we're looking to like take it with us into throwing program or with us into the cage. It's really big. And I'll say that like it has its place. We got to, every organization may have a different idea of like kind of where that fits. And then within that, every coach may have a different idea of where it fits. Some people think it fits like exclusively in the weight room. Some people want to get it out of the weight room and it fits only on the field. I think it's both. We have guys doing generalistic moves in the weight room, like things that are like not all that specific or particular what they're going to do out on the field. And then we have guys like in the tunnel, in the cage, or like literally out on the field before throwing program as a pitcher, doing these things as a segue between their warm up and their skill work. And I see it as both. I think there's general, just like with anything, right? Like there's general weight room moves that you would do. Like, yeah, probably everybody should squat, hinge, do some kind of a frontal variation, like yada, 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 right? Split pattern. And there are things that are like maybe a little more nuanced that you would do with a basketball player that I may not do, and then things that we would do with a baseball population that probably you wouldn't do. So I think that like I see the aqua bag or the Franz Bosch skill acquisition-y type stuff in baseball in the same way. It definitely has its place. It's super impactful. I'm biased. I really like that stuff and I have a passion for it. But it's because I've seen guys in a short window of time make some sizable adjustments, from a performance standpoint. And I don't think that there's all that much risk involved. it's not going to make anyone worse. Let's just put it that way, right? So in a worst case scenario, we're warming guys up well. And in the best case scenario, we're warming them up well and we're able to address a concern or a need in like 10, 15 minutes. We don't have to sit there and overcoach them and overcue them and actually take them away from what it is that they're trying to do. We have a lot of those guys in baseball, a lot of guys that like to overanalyze. They're in their head about like what it should look like or feel like. And I think that's because it's highly skilled and technical in nature. Guys try to be perfect. And it's like, no, that's not the point. Right. So these things are given to them to actually reduce the mental demand of the performance task.
Nice, nice. Because I think like, even with track, so at Louisville, I also would help with the track and field like group, but not as a strength coach, but more as an assistant for like sprinting, jumping, like help them clear the mechanics. So the
Nice.
interesting part is like what we kind of utilize a lot like uh the aqua ball, the aqua bag, the France ball system, like hip lock stuff into
Yeah.
like our lifting or like recovery or even warm up. And they say that it feel better. It feel much better.
Yeah.
So
Dude,
it's
it's good stuff. And that's a good point too. Like that's, that the whole Franz Bosch thing is like that. It's obviously for us in baseball, like that's a sprint specific like system, right? Like that's where it like originated. So now it's kind of like taking these like qualities, these attractor states, figuring out what the attractor state is for us in baseball and figuring out what matters and then like doing it every day. So I think like that's, a hip lock drill for you in track and field may look different than our hip lock where we're looking to, keep a stacked torso. Maybe our hip lock is backside glute, front side ab wall as we move down the slope. Your hip lock is getting full extension, dorsiflex or plantar flexion, and you're staying tall, and it's more of a sprint drill. You know what I mean? Like an absolute sprint drill. So maybe it looks different, but like the whole idea of it is the same, which I think is like now the problem solver comes back to me of like, how can we take what is really good in your world and your context and make it make sense for us? And does it fit or not? And I think that every organization may have a different idea of where it fits and how it fits. But all I know is there's a lot of organizations that are doing it. Some of them are doing it better than others. And a lot of the organizations that have robust player development systems are doing some of these things to try to bridge the gap, fill in these areas of need and training. Because I think if we're relying exclusively on the weight room, we're going to be in trouble. You know what I mean? If we're truly strength and conditioning and that's it, we're in trouble, right? Like there's a lot left to be had in all of these spaces that can influence on-field performance, and certainly health outcomes as well.
nice, nice, nice. So uh the last part of the podcast, I'm gonna ask like, so in basketball world, we use force plate, we use velocity based training, we use what else? Oh, we use GPS, like no matter it's Connexon, Catapult, whatever it is. Like these are the big things that like in basketball world we kind of utilize. So in baseball, uh, I know you guys utilize more like the 3D motion capture 3D like camera system. Like, how about other sport technology you guys utilize?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. And I'll say that I've been super fortunate in being now part of two different organizations that do things like I would say differently. There are a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of differences as well. In my first organization, like we albeit a few years back, we didn't utilize a lot of like objective measurables at the time in the weight room. We had force plates. We use them intermittently. We use them a lot in a rehab environment. I don't know if that was just resource allocation or if that was just like we were trying to figure out where it fits and how it fits. Obviously, the limitation of a force plate is it for the most part, it's bilateral, happens in the sagittal plane, right? Currently, like that's kind of like where we get that information. So then it becomes of okay, are these different things that we're seeing on the force plates, for example, is that indicative of how they also move side to side rotationally? Does what they're doing in the weight room show up also out onto the field? So now we start to parlay the information that we're getting from force plates with, some of the 3D motion capture stuff. So I'll say that in my first organization, we didn't use a lot of objective data. It was more subjective in nature. It was more like using intuition and you figuring out like, how does this fit? Does that fit? Giving it was like, we were manually tracking different like yardages and sprint exposures and stuff like that. Could also have just been because it was like dating back to 6 or 7 years ago. Also, you know what I mean? As sports science has now made, it's definitely some headway over the course. Like over the course 5 or 10 years, past 5 or 10 years, big influx here of sports science. Now with the White Sox, we're utilizing a lot of data and tech. So in the weight room, we're using force plates. We use a Nord board. We use velocity-based training, gym wire system. We utilize some heart rate data for prescription of conditioning and stuff like that. Rest to work to rest ratio, stuff like that. We also use Catapult, the GPS system you discussed there, which is a new thing for us this year out on the field to track all things from, total volumes, sprint exposures, high speed running exposures. The unit also picks up on swings and throws and stuff like that. So it's pretty cool. To my knowledge, right now we're not using the data on the swings and the throws yet. We're trying to figure out where and if that fits. We certainly use for our position player group all of the other information, right? So we take all this information, we contextualize it, we plug it into an acute chronic, figure out where guys are of the course of the last 7 days, and then in comparison to how that relates to where they are over the course of the past month or so. And we figure out, okay, do we need to give them a little bit? Do we need to push recovery? Are they in a good spot? And we prescribe high speed running exposures or sprint exposures to accommodate if necessary to try to keep them in a good place, just to lessen or mitigate the risk of injury, right? Like obviously we can't take that away. We can do every single thing that we can correctly and everything that's within our parameters of what we see fit, and things happen, right? Conversely, we could do nothing right and nothing happens, right? So it's like, that's kind of to my point when we first got started of like sometimes like there's a lot of value placed in these different things, and I think it's sometimes like we can maybe get a little carried away with like, maybe we shouldn't take credit for X, Y, and Z, and on the other hand, maybe just because something happens doesn't mean that something went awry. You know what I mean? Like sometimes things just happen. that's just the way that sports are, right? And especially
Yeah.
baseball, repetitive in nature, and we do it every single day. So we definitely leverage a lot of tech where I currently am. Whereas like in my previous experience, we dabbled with it, we utilized it and like isolated it, spaces, but it wasn't more of a holistic model where, hey, all of our player development affiliates have access to this tech. Whereas now, like here in our weight room, we have all of the tech that I spoke on. And we try to contextualize this information to best create a plan from a weightlifting training standpoint in the weight room, but also out on from a workload standpoint, from a management standpoint, with what they're doing that's maybe more outside of our control out on the field. So it's a big thing in baseball, the whole workload management thing and strategically giving guys what they need for us to best help them from a performance and a health standpoint. And this is just one of these ways that that we're experimenting with, and obviously it's evolving as we go, right? Like my guess is we don't do it the same way this time next year as we do right now. Probably make some adjustments. We certainly have made some adjustments from last year. So it's a big thing, and I think the biggest thing with it is you just got to contextualize it, make it make sense, and then have some actionable tasks that you can take off of the data. If you're collecting to collect, sometimes it just clutters. You know what I mean? It actually distracts from like your effectiveness as a coach. If you're just too caught up in what the number says, and you lose sight that you're working with a human being that shows up differently every single day of the year. You know what I mean? There's external factors in play here too. So it's a really good question.
Nice. Appreciate you. I also like your at the end of the answer you brought, like don't get too caught up on the numbers. Like focus on the human in front of you. I like that. I like that.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's an important point to make, just because as we all are very intelligent and passionate about what we do, right? Like I think we're all guilty. Every single one of us is guilty at some point in time of just getting too caught up in our own little, you know, specialty or world, right? Like
Yeah.
if I'm passionate about the water ball stuff, it would be like only if I cared about the water ball stuff and forgot about the weight training program. Like we can't do
Yeah.
that, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's like, hey, like part of being a really good professional and a really good like strength coach and performance person for these players is we owe it to them, we owe it to the organization to take a step back, look at it from a 30,000 foot view. Yes, we want to get this information. We want to also do it and keep you safe. And we also want to be able to utilize the data. So, you know, if we're knowingly getting poor data, maybe we wait till tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like, or maybe we wait till the next day. Like, let's make sure that this makes sense, knowing that like baseball was just fine for all of these years before this came on. You know what I mean? And in fact, there's a lot of variables in play here, but like injuries have skyrocketed, right? So like sometimes if we're not careful, maybe we can outsmart ourselves and do things like too aggressively just because that's what we're with school for, we're passionate about. I think it's important to just remember that all of these things are in place for a reason, and they help us do our jobs well. But on the flip side, like any good thing taken to an extreme is no longer a good thing. So I think like reminding ourselves of that and taking ourselves back to like, hey, let's do the basics, the basic things really well, right? Like really, really well, and execute them on a daily basis. Then we can start to supplement with all of these like newer, shinier, more specific, targeted type interventions, because then we just amplify on top of our solid foundation. If we jump straight to trying to do these things and we're a poor mover, or we don't have adequate strength levels, or we can't express our strength as power specific to what we're doing out in the field, I would argue we're misguided.
Nice. Nice. I love this. I love this. So, uh, that's all I have for you today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, where can they reach out to you?
Yeah, I think social media is probably a good spot. I'm pretty responsive on that, or at least I try to be. So Instagram or Twitter, either one. I think my handle is Logan underscore Jones 95. Um, Obviously more than happy to talk shop with anyone or answer any questions, or obviously here to learn as well. So open to feedback, constructive criticism, whatever it is. um, but yeah, I think that that's probably the best place. And I'll just acknowledge that I've been super fortunate in getting to where I am today, and a lot of people have helped me get here. And I kind of see it as my due diligence and responsibility to flip the script and share that information that I've been given, and share my experiences too, because certainly if we can help others along in their journey as well, our industry performance, strength and conditioning, both in the collegiate setting, professional and private sector, whatever, is going to be a lot better. And I think that we like should be here to uplift one another, not like we're not, like not compete with or destruct. So I think we're here to uplift, and I think the more we can influence one another in a positive way, probably the better we all are for that. Um, so yeah, I really appreciate you asking me on again. This is our what, third one,
Yeah.
maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really appreciate it, man. Like this is always very enjoyable for me. And if there's anything that I can do to help you along in your journey, like please, I'm here for that. So thanks again, Eric.
Thank you. I appreciate you, man.